I remember the exact moment he said it, not because the words hurt, but because of how casually he dropped them. The new COO had been in the building for less than 3 hours, still had his welcome badge clipped to his pocket. People were still complimenting his handshake. And yet at 9:07 a.m., he looked at the stack of ERP audit reports on my desk, leaned back slightly and said, "These are redundant." The name's Matt Johnson, by the way. 47 years old, been doing systems auditing for defense contractors longer than this kid's been out of college. Not wrong, not inefficient, not outdated, redundant. Like the 8 years I'd spent quietly untangling vendor mess in our government contracts were some sort of hobby I refused to give up. I didn't push back. Not immediately. You don't survive long in defense contracting by arguing with someone who thinks they're here to streamline the machine. You watch, you listen, you measure the distance between their confidence and their understanding. And with Nick Patterson, the gap was wide as the Dallas skyline. He had the resume, he had the rhetoric, he had Daddy's last name, our CEO's son, fresh from his Wharton MBA. But he didn't have context. Most people didn't know what my job actually was at Lone Star Defense Systems. They thought I checked invoices for our military logistics contracts. That's what HR wrote in the description years ago. What I really did was find the errors our IT vendor insisted didn't exist. Mismatched government purchase orders, duplicated line items in federal systems, misapplied discounts on classified projects, accidental zeros added by someone half asleep or half trained. Over time, the vendors started treating my corrections as part of the natural workflow. They'd send sloppy batches to our $180 million operation. I'd clean them, and no one asked questions except me. For months, I'd warned Tim Anderson, my old director, that the ERP system wasn't as automated as the vendor kept claiming. Errors weren't decreasing, they were shifting. Smaller mistakes disappearing, larger ones creeping in. Someone on their side had figured out that if you bury a bad adjustment inside a high-volume cycle with government contracts, it gets lost unless someone like me manually cross-reconciles it. That someone was me. But now, apparently, that part was redundant. Nick flipped through one of my audit notebooks, one I'd spent weeks compiling to document flagged discrepancies in our defense systems. He skimmed 2 pages, closed it, and gave it back with a polite nod. "Good work," he said. "But we don't need this level of granularity. The vendor should handle their own errors." I didn't answer, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear the rest. He took my silence as compliance. "Let's sunset these," he added, tapping the folder. "If the vendor wants accountability, they can provide it. We don't need internal double checks. It slows things down." There it was, the phrase every seasoned analyst recognizes: slows things down. Translation: I don't know how this works, but I want it simpler so I feel in control. I asked one question because it was the only one that mattered. "Do you want me to stop the reconciliations immediately or finish this cycle first?" He didn't hesitate. "Immediately. I'll take responsibility for the transition." That last line wasn't confidence. It was arrogance disguised as ownership. But it was also exactly what I needed. I typed up a summary of his directive while he stood by my desk, handed him the memo, and watched him sign it. He didn't even read the full text, just scanned for keywords, signed, and walked away. The room didn't feel hostile. It felt strangely calm. I'd been preparing for something like this for months, not because I wanted it, but because I knew someone eventually would get ambitious enough to think the vendor's automation pitch was real for defense contracts. My background probably made me more cautious than most. 22 years ago, I was handling logistics coordination for the Army in Iraq. Different systems, same principle. When someone tells you the tech is foolproof, that's when you double-check everything. Supply chain mistakes over there could cost lives. Here at Lone Star, they just cost money, but the discipline stays with you. I saved the signed memo, time-stamped the file, and removed myself from the reconciliation workflow. No backdoor checks, no silent fixes, no last-minute catches. I did exactly what Nick Patterson asked. That afternoon felt empty, not in a sad way, but in a quiet, anticipatory way, like the silence before a storm that only you can smell in the air. Because here's the thing, nobody tells new executives about defense systems. You can ignore a process, you can ignore a person, you can ignore a warning. But government financial systems don't ignore anything. I spent the rest of that first day reorganizing my workspace, cleared out the reconciliation folders, archived the audit trails, set my status to available for reassignment. Colleagues kept asking if I was okay. Word travels fast in a company our size, 800 employees. Everyone knows when someone's role gets cut. Tim Anderson stopped by around 4 p.m. He didn't say much, just shook his head and muttered something about kids with degrees thinking they know better. Tim was old-school defense contractor. Been here since Lone Star started with 50 people in a strip mall. He understood that government work wasn't like selling widgets to Walmart. "How long you think it'll take?" he asked, not looking at me directly. "For what? For them to figure out what you were actually doing?" I thought about it. The vendor ran their automated cycles every 3 days. Without my reconciliations catching the drift, I figured we'd start seeing problems by the weekend. "Maybe a week," I said. Tim nodded. "I'll keep the documentation ready." By the next morning, the first discrepancy appeared in our DoD contracts, and that was only the beginning. The first discrepancy showed up at 8:42 a.m. the next day. A small one, almost invisible. The kind of error only someone who spent years inside a defense contractor's ERP system can feel, not see. I was reviewing tickets in the shared queue, trying to stay out of the mess I'd just been removed from, when I noticed a tiny shift in the vendor's batch summary for our military logistics account. Nothing dramatic. A compliance value that should have been 0.8 suddenly wasn't. Not enough to raise alarms with government auditors. Just enough to tell me something upstream had changed in our federal contracts. I didn't say a word. Nick wanted the vendor to own their numbers in our defense systems, so I let them. The funny thing about government contract work is how precise everything has to be. When you're billing the Department of Defense, every decimal point matters. Every line item gets scrutinized. The Pentagon doesn't accept close enough on a $50 million logistics contract. But our vendor's automated system was built for commercial clients, where a few percentage points here and there don't trigger congressional investigations. By noon, 5 more discrepancies appeared. All of them small, all of them predictable. Without my reconciliations, the system didn't fall apart instantly. It drifted slowly, quietly, in the same direction every time, a direction I'd been manually correcting for months in our government work. I kept working on other projects, trying to stay busy. Asset management reports, security compliance documentation, routine stuff that didn't require vendor oversight. But my eyes kept drifting to the batch summaries scrolling across the shared monitor. Each cycle showing more drift, more tiny errors accumulating like interest on a bad loan. Around 1:30 p.m., Sarah Patterson stopped by my desk. The CEO's daughter, our CFO, sharp as her old man, but without the ego. She'd always treated me with respect, probably because she understood the technical side better than most executives. "How are you adjusting to the workflow changes?" she asked, diplomatically avoiding mention of her brother's directive. "Following instructions," I said, letting the vendor handle their own quality control now. She nodded, but I caught the flicker in her eyes. Sarah knew the defense contracting business. She'd grown up around it, heard the war stories from contractors who learned the hard way that government work demanded perfection. "If you notice anything unusual," she said carefully, "feel free to document it, for historical reference." Translation: keep track of what happens because we might need evidence later. Sarah Patterson didn't get to be CFO by accident. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. At 2:17 p.m., Tim Anderson walked over to my desk. He didn't sit down. He didn't smile. He just asked, "You didn't touch any of the defense batches today, right?" "No," I said. "Nick's directive." He nodded slowly, the way someone does when a fear they've lived with finally proves itself. "True. All right, keep it that way." But Tim looked worried, really worried. He'd been through government contract audits before, seen what happens when the numbers don't add up. Defense contractors don't just lose money when systems fail. They lose clearances. They lose future bidding opportunities. They lose their reputation in a very small community. At 2:45 p.m., I decided to take a walk around the building. Needed some air, needed to clear my head. As I passed the procurement department, I heard voices getting louder. Not shouting, but that kind of controlled tension you hear when professionals are trying to stay calm while discussing something serious. "The discount matrix doesn't match what we submitted to the Pentagon," someone was saying. We're showing different percentages on the prime contract versus the subcontractor agreements. Must be a timing issue with the quarterly update, came the reply. The vendor said their new automation handles all the calculations now. I kept walking, but the pieces were already forming in my mind. Discount matrices on defense contracts aren't suggestions. They're legally binding commitments to the government. If our system was showing different percentages internally versus what we'd certified to DoD, that wasn't just an accounting error. That was a compliance violation. Back at my desk, I opened my personal documentation folder, not the official audit files that Nick had sunset, but my own notes that I'd been keeping for months. Pattern recognition stuff, mostly. Trends I'd noticed but hadn't formalized into reports yet. The vendor employee username that kept appearing in suspicious adjustments. TechSys Morrison for 47. Always small changes, always during high-volume processing days, always trending in the vendor's favor. I'd flagged it 6 months ago, passed the information to Tim, who'd passed it up the chain. Apparently it never reached Nick's desk, or if it did, he'd ignored it. At 4:28 p.m., I heard a voice echo from Nick's office. Michelle Davis, the vendor manager, a woman who'd worked with our defense contracts for years. She spoke calmly, professionally, but even from across the room, I could hear the strain tightening the edges of her voice. "No, that adjustment didn't come from us," she said. "No, those numbers were clean on our end. If they changed internally, your team needs to check the workflow on the government side." It wasn't anger. It was confusion. The kind people feel when a system that hasn't broken in years suddenly starts slipping on basic arithmetic with federal contracts. Michelle had been managing vendor relationships since before Nick was out of high school. She knew the difference between a system glitch and something more serious. I stayed out of it completely. But inside, irritation was building. Not because the system drifted, but because everyone acted surprised. They'd been warned repeatedly, quietly, professionally. Every anomaly, every inconsistency, every flagged correction in our defense work, I documented them all, and Nick had dismissed the entire structure in one morning. The afternoon dragged on, punctuated by more phone calls, more hushed conversations, more people walking past my desk with worried expressions. By 4:45 p.m., the shared monitor was showing 12 separate discrepancies in the day's defense contract processing. 12 errors that would have been caught and fixed if I'd still been doing my job. 12 problems that were now someone else's responsibility. At 5:03 p.m., Nick finally came to my desk. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the signed directive. He simply asked the one question executives ask when they realize they might have underestimated the complexity of a government contractor's system. "Did anything unusual happen in yesterday's defense cycle?" I looked him in the eye. "You asked me to stop reconciling, so I stopped. That's the only change." He held my gaze a second too long, not angrily, analytically, like he was trying to decide whether I was being passive-aggressive or simply stating a fact. It didn't matter, because the next question told me everything about how his confidence was starting to crack. "Can you take a quick look at this batch? Just a quick one. Off the record." There it was, the first crack in his confidence. I shook my head calmly. "I can't, not without reversing your directive. You said the vendor owns their numbers now in our defense contracts." His jaw tightened, not because I refused, but because I reminded him of his own words. "I'll handle it," he muttered and walked back. That night, for the first time in 8 years, I left Lone Star Defense Systems on time. No late checks, no quiet corrections, no saving the government contract system from itself. And as I walked to my truck in the Dallas heat, a thought hit me. Not dramatic, not vengeful, just brutally honest. They weren't prepared for what I'd been protecting them from. By the next morning, the discrepancies in our defense contracts wouldn't be small anymore. And I didn't know it yet, but this was the day everything would start sliding out of their hands fast. Day 2 started with an email from procurement that made my coffee taste bitter. Urgent. Discount reconciliation required for DoD Contract 7745B. That was our biggest military logistics contract, worth $35 million annually. If something was wrong with the discount structure, we weren't talking about small accounting adjustments anymore. By the third morning, the ERP system wasn't drifting anymore. It was slipping. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make every department uncomfortable without knowing why. especially dangerous when you're dealing with government defense contracts. At 9:14 a.m., an alert popped up in the finance channel, the kind we almost never saw. Defense Batch 47 requires secondary validation. Secondary validation wasn't a real requirement. It was a placeholder flag, a silent alarm built years ago by an engineer who probably never imagined anyone would rely on it. It only triggered when the numbers coming from the vendor contradicted our internal ledger by more than a safe margin, a margin I used to correct manually in our DoD work. I wasn't part of that workflow anymore. So the flag stayed red. 2 minutes later, another alert, then another. A chain reaction. Small errors colliding with slightly bigger ones, all feeding into our quarterly expense cycle for military contracts. Finance analysts started pinging each other frantically. Procurement asked if someone had updated the discount matrix for government purchases. Accounts payable blamed a system timing issue. Nobody blamed the vendor, not yet. The irony wasn't lost on me. These were the same people who'd nodded along when Nick announced his streamlining initiative. Efficiency, automation, modern processes. Now they were scrambling to understand why their modern processes were producing medieval results. At 9:31, I heard the first sign that Nick was starting to panic, the sound of his office door closing. Executives don't close doors unless something's wrong. Inside, voices rose, calm tones trying to stay calm. Michelle Davis, the vendor manager, repeating the same phrase over and over. Our records don't show these changes. Not defensive, just factual. I kept working on my reassigned projects, but it was hard to concentrate. The military logistics experience kicks in during situations like this. In Iraq, when supply chains started breaking down, you could feel it building, small delays becoming bigger ones, communication getting choppy, everyone working harder but accomplishing less. This felt the same way, the organized chaos of a system coming apart. At 9:45 a.m., Sarah Patterson appeared at my desk again. This time she didn't bother with diplomatic language. "Walk me through what you used to do," she said quietly. "The real process, not the job description." I explained it step by step. How I'd catch misaligned purchase orders before they hit government systems. How I'd identify duplicate charges that could trigger DoD audits. How I'd spot the vendor employee who kept making mistakes that always benefited their company. "Texas Morrison 47, I said. Username kept showing up in suspicious adjustments. Always small amounts, always during high-volume days, always in the vendor's favor. Sarah's face went pale. "When did you last flag this?" 6 months ago. Passed it to Tim, who passed it up the chain." She closed her eyes for a moment. It never reached the board level. Of course it hadn't. Nick had been filtering information from day one, deciding what was important enough to escalate to his father and what wasn't. A pattern of small vendor discrepancies probably didn't seem worth mentioning to someone focused on big-picture strategy. At 10:12 a.m., Nick stepped out of his office, face tight, shoulders stiff, pretending nothing was wrong. But I'd worked long enough in defense contracting to recognize the look of someone who'd just been told something expensive. He walked straight toward me. "Can you explain why the defense contract reconciliation is out of range?" he asked. Not, "Can you help me understand?" Not, "We're seeing an anomaly," a direct question with an implicit accusation buried inside. I answered plainly, "I didn't touch the cycle per your directive." He swallowed that hard. Then he tried again. "Look, can you walk me through what you used to do? Just high level." I did. Every step. No embellishment, no bitterness. Just the truth. The vendor's ERP system wasn't built for defense contract nuance. It needed oversight. Real oversight. Consistent oversight, especially with government work. By the time I finished, he wasn't angry. He was pale, because suddenly the discrepancies weren't minor anymore. They were accumulating in our federal contracts. At 11:03, procurement discovered a $142,000 adjustment in our military logistics account that shouldn't exist. At 11:17, accounting flagged mismatched tax tables on DoD purchases. At 11:26, AP found duplicated payments. Small ones, scattered but too consistent to ignore in government work. Every issue led to another. Every audit trail had gaps. Every automated fix the vendor claimed to handle wasn't fixing anything in our defense systems. Nick tried to hold it together, but his voice kept tightening each time someone approached him with a new problem. I watched him pace between offices, phone pressed to his ear, hand on his forehead like he was trying to push the math back into place through sheer force of will. But numbers don't negotiate, and mistakes don't stay small when they stack, especially in government contracts. By 12:40 p.m., 3 departments were involved. By 1:10 p.m., finance escalated it to a cross-functional review. By 1:35 p.m., Nick had to admit, at least internally, something was wrong at the system level with our defense contracts. And that was when I felt something shift inside me. Not directed at him, not even at the company, but at myself. For the first time, I wasn't shocked by the chaos. I wasn't frustrated. I wasn't rushing to fix anything. I was realizing a deeper truth about defense contracting work. You see what people are really made of when systems start failing. Nick relied on confidence over competence. The vendor relied on someone else catching their mistakes, and I had been enabling both by quietly fixing everything behind the scenes. Without me, all 3 were exposed. At 2:02 p.m., Nick sent a message to the team channel. We need full documentation on previous reconciliation processes immediately. He didn't tag me because tagging me would mean admitting I had been right. But that didn't matter. Not anymore. What mattered was what I saw when I opened the day's final batch. Not a mistake, not a drift. A pattern. A deliberate pattern in our defense contract data. Someone somewhere inside the vendor's workflow wasn't making random errors. They were covering something. And by the time anyone else noticed, it would be too late to pretend it was an accident. Everything was sliding fast in our government contracts, and nobody understood how deep it went. Yet, by the 4th morning, the ERP system wasn't slipping anymore. It was breaking. Not all at once. Breakages never happen as one dramatic explosion. They happen as a sequence. One failure feeding another, one minor anomaly turning into a structural collapse in defense contract systems. At 8:07 a.m., procurement flagged a $312,000 discrepancy in military logistics. At 8:19, AP found a batch rerouted to a shadow cost center nobody recognized. At 8:26, accounting discovered 3 invoices pushed through without matching purchase orders, all in government work. These weren't random mistakes. They were coordinated. You don't see that pattern unless you've spent months tracing the invisible seams of a sloppy vendor system. You don't see how someone hides large adjustments inside high-volume days unless you've caught them doing it before in defense contracts. Nick hadn't. Neither had anyone he trusted. At 8:42, he called an emergency meeting. He didn't invite me, but I didn't need an invitation. The walls in that conference room weren't soundproof, and the tone of a panicked executive carries farther than they think. Michelle Davis was the first to speak. "Your internal checks should have flagged this," she said, not realizing the irony. Nick's answer came sharp and defensive. "We removed redundant processes based on your automation roadmap." Michelle didn't blink. Our automation never replaced manual reconciliation for defense work. We've said that in every quarterly review. Silence. Heavy, ugly. Because there it was, the truth he didn't want to hear. He had cut the only layer keeping our government contract system intact. At 9:14 a.m., everything snapped. I heard the notification before I saw the screen. A full system freeze warning. Not a soft alert, not a yellow flag. A stop-the-line red banner across the finance dashboard. Critical exception. Vendor adjustments exceed threshold. Threshold wasn't a suggestion. It was a fail-safe built years ago to catch mass manipulation in defense contracts. I opened the logs, and the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The vendor hadn't just been sloppy. They'd been hiding adjustments, large ones, behind my reconciliations. Adjustments I unknowingly cleaned every month in our government work. And now, without me, they stacked one on top of another, layer after layer until the system couldn't pretend anymore. At 9:22, Nick stormed out of the conference room and went straight to my desk. No greeting, no pretense. "I need you in the review room now." I didn't move. "You removed me from that process," I said calmly. "You signed the memo." He closed his eyes for a second. Not in anger, but in something closer to dread. "This isn't the time for blame. It's not blame, I replied. It's documentation. For a moment I thought he was going to lose his temper, but he didn't. He swallowed it hard. Please, he said. We're past the point of quick fixes. That wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he could manage. So I stood up and followed him. Inside the review room, everyone was panicking. Procurement, accounting, AP, everyone crowded around the screen. Michelle was scrolling through error logs with shaking hands. Then she said the words that changed everything. This isn't a glitch. These are manual adjustments, not automated, not accidental, manual. Nick leaned over her shoulder, from your side or ours. Michelle didn't defend her team. She didn't raise her voice. She just clicked one button. The audit trail filter. A list populated instantly. Every single adjustment that caused our defense contract system to break came from one vendor employee. I recognized the username immediately, Texas Morrison 47, the same one I'd flagged 6 months ago. Suspicious rounding, repeated discount mistakes that always favored the vendor, staged to look like accidents but always trending upward in government work. I had warned Tim Anderson. He had documented the warning, and Nick had never read that file. Michelle spoke again, more quietly now. If these adjustments hit final processing, the correction fee from our side could be substantial. How substantial? Nick asked, voice barely controlled. Michelle typed a calculation. The room went dead still. $4.2 million. Nobody breathed. Because now it wasn't about system errors. It wasn't about workflow efficiency. It wasn't even about blame. It was about liability. About contracts. About who pays when defense work goes wrong. Nick finally turned to me, pale, sweating, realizing maybe for the first time the scale of what he had dismantled. What do we do? Not, can you fix this? Not, help me. Just a raw question from someone standing on unstable ground. I took a breath, and something inside me settled. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. We don't do anything, I said. We document. That's all. Every step, every signature, every directive, every recommendation. You'll need it for the escalation. He blinked. Escalation to who? I looked at the screen, at the $4.2 million estimate glowing red. To legal, to finance, to the vendor's compliance team. Then I added, because it was the truth, and to the board. The board meeting wasn't dramatic. Corporate reality is quieter than the movies suggest. By the time Nick presented the escalation packet, the documentation, the audit logs, the vendor trail, the $4.2 million liability projection, the board already had the numbers. The meeting lasted 46 minutes, just enough time for them to walk through the audit trail, including the memo Nick signed with my summary of his directive, his signature, his timestamp, his approval. Every consequence flowed directly from that. Nick wasn't fired. Corporate rarely fires executives over one mistake, even expensive ones. What they did was worse. Stripped him of operational authority, moved him to a strategic role with no real power. The kind of position companies create when they want someone to leave quietly on their own. The vendor's employee was terminated within 24 hours. Their company absorbed the $4.2 million fee without argument. They couldn't afford to push back with that audit trail. Around 3 p.m., when everything settled, Tim Anderson walked over and set a folder on my desk. You kept this place together longer than anyone knew, he said. They see that now. The folder contained my job, restored and upgraded. New title, raise, full authority over vendor reconciliation oversight for all government work. Not because they were rewarding me, but because they finally understood the value of what they almost removed. That evening, as I shut down my computer, I opened Nick's memo one last time. The one where he'd written, "Vendor owns their numbers." I saved it again, not as evidence, but as a reminder. Systems don't break suddenly. People break them slowly through ego, shortcuts, and believing experience is optional. But someone always sees the cracks. And if they step away, even for one cycle, everything that happens after isn't revenge. It's just math. And in this case, $4.2 million worth of it.